Just a quick reminder for everyone, I think you know, but we are recording the session and the recording will be made available at the end. We are also going to remind you to use the chat. As always, we always want to leave time for questions, which we will try to do this time. But as always, if you have questions for any of the speakers, please put them in the chat. The speakers are prepared to look at the chat. They will engage with you. As always, if you haven't joined us before, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us what this topic means to you and why you care so much about rural communications, or maybe share what you're working on in this space, or why, if you hear something that resonates with you, we want to know as well. And finally, since this is our last workshop, if there are other topics that you think we should cover in our rural dialogues, please, I'm open to suggestions. So if you have a topic that you think would be useful for us to gather around and have a fireside chat about, I think that would be useful. So I think we are in a good place, Victor. Maybe you can share my slides. What I wanted to do today is maybe start us off by reminding us of what we've learned since, we've had a few conversations now about rural communications. And what I wanted to remind us of, next slide, please, is very quickly what we've learned. We started off with where when communication breaks down. Um, you can click through all slides. Everyone knows at this point that I always have too many animations. What did we learn in the first workshop? That the media landscape has changed. That's a key point. We've also learned that the journalism has changed and there are now different types of people who are delivering information, influencers, content creators. So what used to be a very uniform environment is much more fragmented. And that means that often rural stakeholders are learning about information before even government is ready to share it. So that's a very important piece of what we learned from our first workshop. Next slide, please. I tried to put what I heard into a kind of summary. It's not a clean one, but there are some gaps in what we've learned. And this came also out of the first workshop. Communities don't understand. There's an intent gap behind the policy. I would love our speakers today to tell me if I got this right or not. Operational gap, communities are unable to access or comply with policies, and then a legitimacy gap, they feel their thoughts are not heard, they're not engaged. So there are some gaps, and this is contributing to why rural communication may or may not be working as well as we'd like it to work. Next slide, please. And then we talked a bit about, you can click through, what rural communication could look like. And here we had one speaker who talked about taking the campaign approach, being more long-term, being sustained, broadcasting, bringing in people, simple language, moving away from urban-centric framing, and don't assume everyone has access to digital. So maybe change a bit the channels that you're using. Heard a lot about trusted local messengers, and bringing in kind of cooperation, rural as partners in sharing information. Um, Next slide. And what I tried to put on the slide, not cleanly, was what I think is important is what leads to the breakdown. Unpopular decisions communicated poorly. What gets you into what my colleagues, would say a vicious cycle. Um, and it's this unpopular decision, misunderstanding, affecting policy uptake, trust. So there's a combination of things, right? And I'm sure you can think of your own things to put in this circle, and we could populate it with many other things. But this gets you started on how it creates a circle, right? And we want to think about how to like unpack that. And I thought it was important to frame it this way because this affects policy. This affects good policy. It affects policy uptake. It affects the effectiveness of policy, and it sometimes gets overlooked. So it's worth thinking about this in as we're talking about communication. I don't know if I have another slide, but click through and we'll find out together. And yes, this is my final slide. And so I thought that effective communication, you really want to integrate those local voices that came through in the last discussion. You want to think about how to counter that misinformation, and you want to get more targeted and immersive and include different stakeholders, young people, focus on storytelling, apply the spatial lens, all these different things. So with this brief um, PowerPoint, I really wanted just to frame a bit what came out of the two previous workshops, but it's a lot and it's recorded. I encourage you to take a look. And with that, now I wanted to kind of start on what I think today will be a good conversation and a nice way to end it. And that is to think about now that you've sent your communication, is it understood? Do people understand? Did the community understand it? Was it transmitted? How are you measuring? And this is a difficult question because we know that communities aren't measuring, but this is to be provocative. How should you evaluate that your message was received and heard? How should you? It's an important question. It's not being talked about enough, and I wanted to attempt with the collection of folks today to go into this direction. So our first speaker is Emrullah Kaya from Turkey. Why I wanted him to start is because they had the unfortunate experience of a really difficult earthquake that really affected a large swath of their rural areas. So they were confronted with communication and rural communication, both from a crisis point of view. I'm sure there were some lessons learned from that, and there are some probably new ways that they are advancing just on communications because of that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Betty. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Emrullah Kaya, as a senior expert at the Ministry of Industry and Technology in Turkey. It's an honor to be here at this OECD webinar. Today, I want to share our institutional journey following the 2020-30 earthquakes. We will look specifically at how we navigated the challenge of reaching rural communities during a crisis and the strategic lessons we have integrated into our rural development vision. Next slide, please. To understand our approach, we must first look at the scale of the disaster. We are talking about two massive earthquakes, 7.6 and 7.7 magnitude. The total cost reached over $100 billion. It's roughly 10% of our annual GDP. But beyond the numbers, look at the geography: 11 provinces, 124 districts, and more than 5,000 villages. This is not just an urban disaster, it's impacted 3.5 million people living in rural areas. When you have 5,000 separate rural points of impact, traditional one-size-fits-all communication simply does not work, as you know. Next, please. In the early days, we observed a fascinating paradox. While rural areas were hit hard due to vulnerable infrastructure, they actually showed higher social resilience than city centers. The community bonds were stronger. However, we also identified a major risk, the migration of youth. We learned that if the recovery process stretches too long, the younger generation in rural areas quickly migrates to the next best option. This taught us that recovering back to the normal is not just about buildings, it's about timing and keeping the social fabric intact. Next slide, please. Our strategy was divided into 3 phases. In short-term phase was about survival, which are emergency aid and damage assessment. The medium term is about where my ministry stepped in. We launched the post-recovery urgent action plan, focusing on repairing infrastructure and crucially supporting employment. In long-term phases, we are currently here in 2026, updating regional development plans to ensure these areas are not just rebuilt, but are more resilient than before. Next slide, please. Development agencies that are affiliated with my ministry served as the bridge on the ground. We didn't just provide funds, we provided coordination. In the rural context, we focused on sectors like agriculture and local craftsmanship. By mobilizing our agencies, we aim to restart the local economy. Our message was very clear. We are here to help you produce again. This production-first communication was vital for psychological recovery, actually. Next slide, please. To give a sense of scale, 434,000 housing units and more than 21,000 workplaces delivered, more than 13,000 classrooms constructed, major investments in energy, roads, and irrigation, around 17 billion Turkish liras. It's nearly refers to $500 million each for agriculture and SMEs. So this was a multi-sector, large-scale recovery effort. But this raises a key question for us. How do we ensure that such large investments actually create impact on the ground? Next slide, please. Now, how did we actually reach them? Following OECD's measuring effectiveness principles, we moved beyond top-down announcements. On-site transformation, we gave residents the agency to rebuild their own homes with state support. The Muhtar network, it's very important for us. We engaged local village heads, the Muhtars, as our primary communication nodes. They are the trusted voices in the village. And regarding the closing the digital divide, we didn't wait for permanent towers. We used Turksat 5B satellite internet to provide immediate connectivity to rural container cities. Information is a basic need in a crisis. Next slide, please. We operationalized 4 key OECD principles. First principle is about measuring impact using systems like ÇKS. It's a registry system for agriculture to verify that support actually reached beneficiaries. The second one is a two-way dialogue, working with the Muhtars, cooperatives, and local actors to align policies with real needs. Leave no one behind principle is also about reaching remote areas through mobile units and targeted support. And finally, resilient logistics, investing in decentralized infrastructure and networks for continuity. So the key shift was from policy delivery to policy effectiveness on the ground. Next slide, please. And what we learned from these disasters, 3 main lessons emerged for us. First, visual trust matters. Village houses built with local architecture strength, social cohesion. The second one is simplicity matters. Complex tools were translated into clear, usable information. And finally, communication drives retention. Infrastructure is necessary, but we know communication determines whether people stay or return. And to conclude, rural recovery is not only about infrastructure. It requires integrating data-driven monitoring, effective communication, and local engagement. This creates a model of smart and resilient rural development. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for a really brief but really comprehensive overview of both the impact of the earthquake and how you approached your communication. So please pose any questions you have in the chat. Marula, I appreciate very much that you looked at the OECD principles and tried to kind of identify different pieces within that. Now I wanted to turn to our next speaker, Samantha, who I met, I want to say a month ago. It must have been a month ago when I was in, I traveled a bit, but I forget where I was at this point. I think we were in Scotland, if I'm not mistaken. We were. That's right. And I was impressed by how she talked about the communities. So I reached out to her because I wanted to get her perspective on communication, because I had a feeling she had a perspective and that it was going to be interesting, and how to make sure that the information landed, not just that we talked to people, but that they understood it. So I reached out to her with that in mind, and she accepted the challenge. So the floor is yours, Samantha.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's brilliant to be here today, and I'm delighted to share my perspective from Northern Ireland. My name's Samantha Gallagher. I'm Policy and Research Manager with the Rural Community Network, Northern Ireland. So the first thing I want to do, and it's just sort of to set the context here, is if you just move on to the next slide for me there, it is to ask you two questions. Do you think that rural communities are receptive to change? So not in theory, but in practice, when it comes to changes in services, policy reform, or difficult decisions, do you think rural communities are resistant to change, or are they willing to engage in it? And the other thing I want you to think about is, when you hear the word rural, what comes to mind? And those are the two most important questions that we use to frame everything that we do around communication here at Rural Community Network. For some people, I suppose the word rural might mean landscape, fields, farms, villages, open space. And for others, it might be distance, isolation, aging populations, maybe limited access to services. And we often hear the term hard to reach. Now, when I ask this question at a policy level with our public authorities, government departments and local councils here in Northern Ireland, who are all bound by the Rural Needs Act, Northern Ireland 2016, a lot of the time agriculture is the first thing that comes to mind. And this slightly worries me from a rural perspective in Northern Ireland, because our census data here tells us that only 7% of our rural population are involved directly in agriculture. So it's really important that the conversation is much wider than that. How we define rural then really matters, because it shapes how we communicate with rural communities and how we interpret their response to change. The next slide. So just to give you a bit of information briefly about Rural Community Network, we are a regional charitable organisation supporting rural communities across Northern Ireland to have a voice in the decisions that affect their lives, particularly around topics such as poverty, inequality, health, community and good relations. And we do this through our programmes, which support grassroots community development, We do it through our education. We have a community development diploma, and through our policy work using and ensuring lived experience voices and ensure that they inform the decision-making processes. So for example, at the moment, we have 6 research projects where we're exploring those lived experiences right across rural Northern Ireland on a variety of topics, such as just transition, civil contingencies or emergency preparedness, violence against women and girls in rural areas, our rural youth, and our rural health. And what we consistently hear is this: the perception is that rural communities are often not open to change. Apparently, we like all services on our doorstep, and we're not willing to engage if that's not what we're getting. And we also hear that rural communities don't have the capacity to understand policy. And I'm not going to sit here today and deny that sometimes that it is true. Yes, it is, but the reality may surprise you. The issue is not whether rural communities understand the communication, it's whether they trust it and whether they feel part of it. If we can move to the next slide, please. So the first thing I want to look at is the role of data, because it really does underpin everything that follows. In rural communication, what is not measured is often what is not seen. So in a previous life, I worked for Citizens Advice in Northern Ireland. I also worked in private practice as I trained in law, and both of those were in rural areas in Northern Ireland. And there is a lot of hidden poverty. So the statistics, for example, might tell us this particular area is quite affluent, but the reality on the ground tells me, having worked in those areas, that actually there's high numbers of people using food banks, and for some reason that's not aligning with the data set that we then have. And an example of this is the NISRA Poverty and Income Equality Report, and it provides a very important statistical picture of poverty and income across Northern Ireland. No, it's a very important report. It provides Northern Ireland wide income and poverty statistics using equalized household income before and after housing costs, which is really useful. And it's based on the Family Resources Survey with administrative data linkage. So it is strong. It's a really robust population data set, but it's not a rural data set. Because what it does not do is just as important. It doesn't apply a rural-urban classification, and it doesn't use our NISRA settlement classification in its analysis, or provide any rural-specific breakdowns. So whilst it tells us a lot about poverty in Northern Ireland, it tells us very little about how geography then shapes those outcomes. And that creates a real challenge, as I've said, because when rural experience is then not visible in data, it makes it much harder to reflect it in policy, and in turn, much harder to communicate it when difficult decisions are then made and requiring that communication. And I suppose, look, it's not a criticism of the Family Resource Survey. As I said, it is a very strong tool here in Northern Ireland, but there's definitely an opportunity to use it better. And I suppose, like, for example, we could have a consistent rural proofing layer to the analysis, or we could have a cross-departmental commitment to ensuring that data is always has maybe an urban-rural breakdown and lived experience, community-led research where possible. Because if we did that, then we'd have something extremely valuable, and we'd have a consistent benchmark. And I think there's a real opportunity for collaboration here. If government, statisticians and civil society work together, then we could significantly improve how rural reality is reflected in the evidence base. And that would directly then improve how policy and difficult policy decisions are communicated and understood. Next slide, please. Because at the moment, there's clearly a gap then, a gap between what the data says, what the policy intends, and then what people experience in their daily lives. And when that gap exists, communication then becomes slightly more difficult. And it's not because people reject the information, but because it doesn't align with their lived reality. And that is where then trust begins to break down. And I'm going to go slightly off script on this because it just came to me about an hour ago just to share this with you. Last summer in Northern Ireland, things escalated quite quickly when trust broke down. We had race-related disorder, and it didn't emerge in isolation. It reflected deeper feelings of uncertainty and disconnection in some communities. Since then, rural communities have told us that many people feel overlooked, maybe neglected by Stormont or Westminster, and unsure who to turn to for clear, reliable information. And in that space, simplified narratives can take hold, sometimes turning, I suppose, complex issues like housing or crime into single causes, despite other evidence. And this miscommunication or misinformation can gain traction. And that doesn't just misinform, it deepens mistrust and makes meaningful engagement harder. And we've seen how quickly that can turn without clear, consistent communication that is people-focused, that I suppose the gap then can widen and tensions escalate. And we've seen that last summer with those race-related riots right across sort of different pockets of Northern Ireland. There's a clear role here for leadership to be present, to communicate openly and ensure no community is left behind, because if that space isn't filled with trust, it won't stay empty. And I suppose that's a lesson for us in terms of that risk management. I think it would be good to turn, maybe to the next slide, and have a look at maybe what has worked so far here in Northern Ireland. And the most effective communication is not top down, it's relational, it's trusted and rooted in community infrastructure. And I was very interested to hear what Betty Ann said at the start, that this is something that is coming out as a key trend in this conversation, that sort of trusted role of rural organisations. And I want to give a couple of examples. In rural County Fermanagh, which is a border county with the Republic of Ireland, community groups identified a gap in healthcare provision for older people. And they secured small grants to develop an armchair exercise programme for older people. Health is a very contentious topic in the area. The area has lost a number of key services in their local hospital, for example, and there's an ongoing campaign. So it's a very contentious topic in this area. And yet they recognised a need and they've plugged it. So on the surface, it looks like a simple intervention, but it does three important things. It improves the physical health of an ageing population. It tackles social isolation and loneliness, and it increases accessibility. But crucially, it works because it was designed and delivered by the community themselves, not to them. And communication happened through that trusted local network, not with formal messaging. They basically sought funding through a small micro grant scheme, and they made a little go a long way. I'm going to be very bold and say they could teach our health trusts here how to spend their money better, because a little genuinely did go a long way. Another example is in another rural border community in County Armagh, and it's a youth-led organisation that is leading the way on violence against women and girls. The context here is that we have had 30 women murdered in Northern Ireland since 2020, and many of those women lived rurally. Obviously, it's a highly emotive topic, and it's receiving a lot of media attention at the moment in Northern Ireland. The response this group had was to create an open space, an ongoing conversation that allowed them to discuss violence against women and girls openly and locally. And they developed community manifestos for the protection of women and girls with a local lens, place-based. And they also actively explored the role of men and young boys in prevention and change. And I thought this was really significant because I mentioned earlier we're doing a piece of research on violence against women and girls in rural areas. And one of the key early findings we have is that many men are struggling to find their place in this conversation. And yet here we have this rural youth group literally in the middle of nowhere leading the way. So for me, it shows that rural communities are not resistant to engagement. It's not that they don't understand. It's not that they don't accept bad news, even on the most difficult of issues, but they engage when communication is trusted, relevant, and rooted in lived reality. Next slide, please. Turn now to what doesn't work, because this is where then obviously bad news becomes most visible. One of the most consistent issues we see is that consultations in Northern Ireland feel like, I suppose our members tell us they feel like it has already been decided. Engagement is happening after key decisions are effectively made. Also, when key things are allowed to happen, such as that example I gave earlier around the hospital in County Fermanagh, where there was a failure to recruit consultant surgeons for one reason or another. A decision was made to temporarily suspend a service at that hospital, and the trust sat in the health committee more recently, I think it was 2 years plus after that decision was made, and said actually it wasn't temporary. So now the community are in arms. There is an ongoing campaign and a judicial review has been lodged. So papers were served just last month on that. And another example that at a more regional level is the development of the anti-poverty strategy here for Northern Ireland. At co-design, and I'm going to put that in inverted commas because they were calling it co-design, but we could argue on the contrary. There was extensive engagement with organisations working on the ground, including rural community groups that had lived experience, had shared their stories and ideas about what needed to happen to address poverty in Northern Ireland. However, when the final draft strategy was published for consultation, many felt that it didn't reflect that input in a meaningful way. And when we went back out to the communities then to help us respond to that consultation, we saw something very telling. We saw apathy. So it wasn't anger, it wasn't a protest, it was disengagement. And people just did not see the point in engaging again. And for me, that's one of the most serious outcomes of poor communication. Once we manage to encourage some people to engage, and this was actually probably our most difficult consultation to date in terms of trying to get groups to engage. On the screen, we have quotes from a couple of the rural groups that we spoke to. The bottom one for me is the most poignant. With no actions and no budget, this will sit on the shelf, and those of us working on the ground will continue to mop up the effects of poverty in our rural communities. And that just blew me away and also broke my heart, given my background, having worked in that sector for many years before moving to this policy role. So you can really see how upsetting it is, and for it to go from being annoyed to apathy then becomes extremely worrying, because if there isn't apathy, then what we find is that there isn't media coverage of it. And when there's not media coverage of it, then it loses its traction. If we can move to the next slide, this is my final example, and I really wanted to keep my conversation today very focused at that grassroots level, real lived experience examples of communication and action. And I thought I'll use wind energy as a case study because there are two sides to this coin, and this is a really good way of showing how it can and can't work. So in some rural areas, wind farm projects have been accepted and supported in rural Northern Ireland. And that was despite there being environmental concerns raised, for example, around noise pollution and damage to soil and various other things. It was accepted because engagement started early. There was transparency throughout the process. Community benefit was built in so they could see the need and the benefit to their own area. And even with environmental impacts being raised, some mitigations were granted, and where there wasn't, there's ongoing dialogue around it and ongoing conversations around it. So they continuously feel involved in the conversation. If we just move to the next slide, on the other side of this, In the Sperrin mountain range in County Tyrone, proposals for the wind farm have faced strong opposition. And whilst there are obviously the environmental concerns, because the Sperrins is an area of outstanding natural beauty, the main concern from the groups that we've spoken to were not the technology itself, but the communication around it. And at the same time that this issue is happening, there's also an issue and a public inquiry launched this week around gold mining in the Sperrins. So they're telling us the communication is top down. It's very technical planning language, purposely to try and confuse them, that they feel it, that they can't be involved. They're being told certain things. There's a lot of spin going on. And there's a lot of tension then in this area of Northern Ireland at the moment as a result of all of this. They said the communications and the consultation felt limited. They felt it was procedural rather than relational. And that led them to conclude that, well, what's the point in engaging? The decision has already been made. And their concerns were not genuinely reflected or heard. The campaign group, as I said, have been set up to oppose this, and that's their Facebook page there on the screen. I'm just obviously sharing that. Due to data protection, I have to let you know that that's their Facebook page and that's their information. And next slide, please. This is I'm wrapping up now. So I suppose, what does all of this tell us, given the questions that I asked at the start? It tells us that rural communities are not all the same. It tells us that they're not inherently resistant to change, but they are highly responsive to how change is communicated. Bad news is not rejected because it is bad news. It's rejected when people are not involved early, when communication is one way, when data does not reflect lived experience, and when there's no visible impact from engagement. But when communication is early and trusted and transparent and rooted in those community relationships, then even difficult decisions can be understood and in many cases accepted. And final slide, please. So I'll just finish with this. How we communicate difficult decisions in rural areas is just as important as the decisions themselves, because this is where trust is either built or broken. Thank you.
Samantha, thank you for a really interesting presentation. You've raised a number of points, but the one that stood out to me is the bad news is not rejected because it's bad news. And I think that's something that sometimes gets overlooked in the conversations. There's a tendency to think that it's because it's bad news and that rural communities cannot understand or deal with bad news. And it's really how it's communicated and how it's experienced that is the issue. So please, for our first two speakers, really interrogate them in the chat. And I invite you both, challenge them a bit. Tell Samantha how you think about rural and maybe give some feedback on the response to the lessons learned from the earthquake in Turkey. We want you to tap their minds a bit and ask your questions. And as we turn to the next speaker, I think you've been hearing a lot of good information. We look forward to getting your perspective on this conversation. So Tove, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm Tove Kullhed, a strategist in regional development at the Region Norrbotten in Sweden. And we just heard strong examples of how to reach and connect with rural communities. I like to add the next level, and that's how we know it actually worked and whether it made a difference. Today, I share one concrete case, the revision of our regional development strategy, Norrbotten 2040, a process which I led. If you're not familiar with what a regional development strategy is, it's essentially a shared long-term roadmap for a region. It sets the direction for what we prioritize, how we collaborate across stakeholders, and guides how regional development resources are used. But the strategy on paper isn't enough. So the question I want to explore is, did the communication in this process actually work? Was it understood? And did it lead to action? And to explore that, let me show you where we work in Norrbotten. Next slide, please. This is the third one, I think you are showing now. No, yeah, that's correct. This is Norrbotten. It is roughly the size of Portugal, but only around 250 people live here. So it's a very large, sparsely populated region. And that means long distances, very different local contexts, and few shared spaces where people naturally meet. We have 14 municipalities, a few small urban centers, and large rural areas in between. And it's very much an active region, with communities, businesses, a university, a major change linked to the green transition. And the transition is happening fast, with large industrial investments, new jobs, and increasing huge pressure on local communities and infrastructure. So in this strategy process, communication had to work across distance and still stay relevant locally. Next slide, please. So why did this matter for us? Because policy is implemented locally and local realities differ. Regional development doesn't happen in one place. It happens across many local contexts. So people need to see how and when they could contribute. And in the previous process, that was exactly where we struggled. And that's what triggered the shift. Next, please. In our previous regional development strategy process back in 2019, we heard the same feedback across the region. The process moved too fast. People didn't know when or how they could influence it, and they couldn't see how their input was used. So we changed the way we worked. This time, the process was designed to allow more people to take part. It also needed to be more transparent and more inclusive. We didn't start with a finished model. We tested, learned, and adjusted along the way with strong process method support from RISE, Research Institutes of Sweden. We ran the main dialogue process during 2024. In early 25, me and my writing team worked through all the input and organized it into themes to support the drafting. The draft then went out for consultation, and we revised it back on feedback, and the strategy was adopted in December last year. Next slide, please. For us, communication needed to do 4 things: reach across long distances and different local realities, be understood locally, make participation possible, and be transparent. And these became our design principles. And that meant we couldn't rely on one format only. Next slide, please. People engaged in different ways, so we needed many ways in. We visited all municipalities and held workshops across different sectors: public sector, business, civil society, and academia. We also created a 60-minute workshop film, so people could take part in a way that suited them, especially if they didn't have time for a full-day workshop. We also funded 2 projects to really make sure we included perspectives from both young people, children, and from civil society. We developed specific workshop formats also for children and young people, and for national minorities and the Sami people. For children and young people, that meant meeting them where they already were, in schools, at the university, in youth councils, youth centers, and we tried TikTok to reach them. We also spoke to adults who work closely with young people across all municipalities. Alongside that, we asked one simple question online. If you imagine living in Norrbotten in the future, what matters to you? Input from workshops, dialogues, and activities was collected digitally through QR codes and online forms. And that meant we could bring everything together and work with it systematically. We used AI as a working tool, not as an answer. It helped us get an overview of a very large amount of input and to identify themes and patterns much faster. But we were also very aware of the risks. So we worked it in an iterative way, step by step, breaking the analysis into smaller parts, checking the results and going back to the raw data when needed. We didn't just accept what the AI produced. We validated it, questioned it, and combined it with our own knowledge. In that sense, it became a way to support analysis, not to replace it. So this was not only about collecting input, it was about building engagement across the whole region. But then the real question becomes, how do we actually know if it worked? Next slide, please. For us, it came down to 3 questions. Did we reach people? Did they understand? And did it lead to action? And by action, I mean people staying engaged, working together and taking the next step at local, regional, and national level, and in collaboration with cross-border and international partners. And one thing really supported understanding, transparency. So let me show you what that looked like in our case. This is what, next slide, please. This is what transparency looked like in practice for us. We used a tool called Mural. If you're not familiar with that, it's like a digital whiteboard. And it was open, no login needed. People could move around the board and zoom in and out to switch between the big picture and the details. This overview helped people follow the process while it was happening in one place. It made the plan visible. The dates for the workshop tour were visible in advance, and the key milestones were visible too. When we collected input, when the draft went out for consultation, and when the decision would be made. So people didn't have to guess where we were in the process. They could check. It also made the workshop dialogue traceable. We posted short summaries continuously from the physical workshops, both the municipal workshops and the thematic ones, such as those focused on skill supply, research, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So after a workshop, people could come back and see what we heard and what was emerging, and also with photos from each workshop. And the overview also gathered the main participation tools in one place, the same endpoints I just described. The other ways to contribute, the film, the youth dialogues, and the simple question were also here in the overview. Their input was collected through our other channels, not summarized here. So even if people entered the process in different ways, there was still one shared mural to connect it all. And that mattered for a very human reason. People worried their input disappears into a black box. Here, they could see the process moving forward. They could see that workshop inputs was reflected along the way, not only at the end. So transparency wasn't a principle on paper. It was something people could actually see and follow. I just want to mention as well, as of course, we use our webpage and our social media. This was where we gathered it all. So with this kind of transparency in place, here's what we saw overall. Next slide, please. When we looked at the results, we saw 3 things. First, reach. We reached all 14 municipalities and all stakeholders, offered many ways to take part, and gathered more than 1,500 inputs. And in a region this large and sparsely populated, that level of participation really matters. Second, understanding. People saw the strategy as relevant. Some even described it as written by people, not politicians. and transparency made the process easier to follow. We also heard people talk more clearly about what regional development is and how they connect to it. Third, action. People didn't stop at giving input. They started asking, what happens next? How do we implement this locally? And for us, that shift from input to what's next is the clearest sign of action. Next slide, please. When we looked at the results, we saw three things. What made this possible? Three things mattered most: inclusion, clarity, and transparency. People needed different ways in. The language had to be simple and clear, and people needed to see how their input was used and what happened next. These were deliberate choices in how we designed the process, and communication is one piece of a larger implementation system. Next slide, please. To make a strategy real, implementation doesn't sit with one actor. Different actors across the region have different mandates and resources. Regional action plans are one important mechanism. They translate our new strategy into practical delivery, but they're not the only one. Implementation also happens through investments in projects, businesses, and services, and through the day-to-day work of organizations and local communities. We also mobilize development funding from local, regional, national, and EU levels. Region Norrbotten supports the system by co-financing initiatives we prioritize that align with both our regional development strategy and our smart specialization strategy, contributing to a broader and more diversified economy. Coordinating, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and creating meeting places and networks so people can work together. Communication doesn't replace this, but it helps it work. And next slide, please. So what does this mean for us in practice? Communication is not something that happens after a strategy. It is part of how a strategy becomes real. When people understand the process and can see how their input is used, they stay engaged. And that supports implementation. And that's the takeaway from our case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you said a lot of really interesting things, and I liked the three pieces about inclusivity, clarity, and transparency stands out. But of course, I like the case study, and I like the clarity and the different steps and how you're thinking about it, and it gives us something to think about collectively about how we could be measuring the effectiveness of communication. So I really love that. I thought, as always, with these conversations, it's always important to bring in a different type of voice. So you've heard from government, stakeholders, but we do need to hear from people who are thinking about communications, or that's their day job, because they always provide a different perspective. And our last speaker today is that person for us, and that's Rebecca. And I wanted her to go last because she got to also appreciate everything that you shared, but her day job is thinking more about communications in the rural space. So Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Betty Ann, and a big thank you to you and Victor for inviting me to join you today. So yes, I've got the great pleasure of finishing your presentations, and the topic is those communications are received and how do you deliver impact. So my presentation is going to be very much on the practical, and we're going to give you some sort of advice and some guidance on some tools and mechanisms that we utilize every day in our work. Next slide, please, Victor. So our team is a communications agency. We're based in Scotland, but we cover the UK and some global clients. We very much work in all mechanisms of communication. And as we've heard from all three speakers today, it's so valuable and important to use different mediums to make sure these messages are well heard. We very much see the world in people and their stories, and it's very much about the grassroots bottom-up approach that you've all been talking about, but being very mindful of that top level as well, and what policy is trying to achieve. And in order for good communications to work, we've got to ensure that these stories are well told and equally well received. So we are working across a wide range of mechanisms to ensure that we do meet those targets, but we also understand our audience, and in doing so, we can deliver those messages very strongly. Next slide, please, Victor. So when we think about communications, there are so many different types you could deploy in your communications and your campaigns. And with research, it really indicates that it's a very noisy environment now. Maybe 20 years ago, you would have traditional mediums such as magazines and newspapers. Today, we have dozens of social media platforms, more created on a daily basis. We have newsletters, both in print and digitally. We've got consultations. There's such a wide range of different tools that we can use, but it's working out which ones are the right ones. But in order to make sure that your message is heard, research kind of suggests, and it's evolved from 7 times to now 5 to 9 times, your message needs to be repeated and reshared with your audience for it to be truly, truly heard and understood. So repurposing your content is really important. Using a mixture of channels is equally important, and using different tactics. And this isn't about adding cost. You can be very clever and very tactical in the way that you do that to make sure that you are using multiple pieces of content in multiple different ways. Next slide, please, Victor. And an example of this is a 3-minute video. So if you take a 3-minute video that was captured to perhaps talk about a piece of consultation or policy, and you're asking the industry, your network, your regional and your rural communities to send forward their thoughts, that video shouldn't be used as a solus piece. It can be turned into a newsletter by transcribing it. You can turn it into quote cards to put in on your social media platforms. It can be turned into audio for podcasts. We're still advocating for, and it was lovely to hear Samantha mention it, media. So print media is so valuable and so important. So thought leadership, why are you doing this consultation? What is it trying to achieve? And more importantly, what does it mean to your audience? How will it impact them? Social media, I mentioned it earlier, there are so many different channels, but everybody is using them now. Facebook used to be called the grandparent channel because it was the place where your grandparents went to see your family and what was happening and what was going on in their families' lives. It's now getting a resurgence of young people. It therefore is a key channel to maybe consider. LinkedIn is growing in terms of that thought leadership and that real approach to understanding why things are happening within rural spaces. And then you've got your video itself, and you can take sound bites from those. So it's just an example of how we as a team at Jane Craigie Marketing will utilise many pieces of content to get that message through. Next slide, please, Victor. But as Betty and I were talking when we sort of briefed for this, discontent is often linked to that poor communication. And it's often a case rural communities are feeling like they've missed out. They weren't told the information, they maybe didn't hear it first, or quite often it's probably bitty. They've heard pieces from different people and it's not all come together. So there's some real tactics that we recommend to ensure that your communications are reached. So knowing your audience and making sure that message is customized to them. We've heard already from the speakers, one message alone won't work. You need different messages depending on who you're targeting. Through our work, we also run the Rural Youth Project, which is an initiative to support young people in rural areas to get their voices heard. And we very much found that to ensure their messages were heard, we needed to be on their level. So we do ideas festivals in the middle of a field where instead of taking them to a stuffy conference building, we're doing it in a marquee surrounded by the beautiful nature and countryside, and suddenly they're relaxed and the messages are really well appreciated. Too many messages, so avoiding overloading. You want one clear message, and that clear message needs to be really simple, and that simplicity will help ensure it does make impact. Again, we heard that earlier in the case of crisis communications. And don't assume understanding. Quite often, policy has a habit of assuming that we understand that they've already been told, but actually they perhaps haven't, and they perhaps don't know the detail. Rural communities want to go back to the basics and understand, what is the purpose of this message. Getting the right tone is so important. Quite often we know in scientific papers, and again with policy, it could be quite formal. But should it be more conversational? What's the purpose and what are you trying to achieve? That tone can make the difference between whether or not it is trusted and whether it's credible and respected to whether or not actually it will be put aside and not listened to. Jargon, it's probably one of the biggest challenges with policy. There is so much jargon quite often in political activity and in community engagement, but actually we need to minimize that jargon. We need to make it relatable. We need to make it grassroots level so that it is clear and is understood. And the last one is being responsive. So being alert to how communities are feeling, and things like Google Alerts will give you media impressions on how and what the stories are in the press. You can scour social media for sound bites, and you can use listening tools to hear what the industry, the sector, whatever the topic is that you're trying to cover is being considered. But it's really important that you're responsive and that you are understanding how your community is feeling before you put any message out. Next slide, please, Victor. But there are many tools, and this is about how do we demonstrate and how do we monitor that engagement. So I've covered a few here in the next few slides in terms of tools that we use to kind of demonstrate and see whether or not our campaigns are working. We wouldn't use one of these in isolation, so you'd want to use a multiple of them. So the first one I've started with is analytics, and particularly in this scenario, newsletters. So we will quite often use MailChimp. It's a very common platform. It is free at some level, depending on how many subscribers you have. But it will give you a wealth of analytical data that will guide you in terms of whether your message is being received, how it is being engaged with, and how often it is being engaged with. So, for example, if you were to send a newsletter to your audience, within 48 hours, you would be able to see how many of your recipients have opened it, what were they clicking and looking at within it, and how often are they going back to that information. And if they're going back multiple times, it would give you an indication that they're engaged and they're wanting to find out more. You can also monitor over a series of newsletters how many times they are engaging with the series. That again shows their engagement level. But one of the most important activities that are in these tools, which quite often are not deployed or used well enough, is the campaign benchmarking. So you can compare that performance against your own newsletters, but you can also compare it against others. So it'll assess, for example, if you were to send a piece of communications out about housing, you could have a look to see other housing campaigns. They wouldn't breach any GDPR by sharing who those campaigns have come from, but it would allow you to see in a rural environment how your newsletter has performed against other housing newsletters. So it gives you an indication whether you're on the right approach. And lastly, in the newsletters scenario, you can look at geolocation. So you can look at where your audience is coming from. So if you're targeting a wide rural area, you can look to see which cities, counties within that area are opening and engaging. And that then might give you an indication to go and further do workshops with them, or to perhaps do some focus groups, because you know they've already got that engagement. But equally, it will give you an indication the areas that perhaps aren't, and where you should target maybe a little bit more of your communications. Victor, next slide, please. Another one which we have all heard from all of us today is social media analytics, and every single social media platform has its own analytics, particularly so Meta, which is your Facebook, your Instagram, and your LinkedIn, your WhatsApp. They have their own inbuilt analytical tools. You get the basic level, but it's really important to make sure you turn on the additional options which give you further demographic data. It doesn't come as standard practice, so it's one of those tick boxes that you need to go into, but if you turn that setting on, you'll get a much richer data set. X, which was formerly known as Twitter, have just in the last 2 weeks upgraded their data. So if you are doing paid activities, so paid social media campaigns, you now get a wealth of information which you perhaps didn't do 2 weeks ago, which will give you, again, the indication of where people are coming from, what their interest topics are, how they're engaging with your comments. And then you've also got LinkedIn and YouTube, which have really, really good analytical data platforms as well. And all of those, with the exception of X, are free. X you have to pay for or do paid activity to see the data. But a small amount, and I mean as simple as in the UK, £20, can actually go a long way and can deliver a really, really rich campaign of engagement. And then you've also got some of the other tools at the bottom there. So you've got Hootsuite, Sprout Social. These are all social media platforms that are globally accessible, and they offer additional ways to monitor tracking, whether it's a hashtag or whether it's a particular campaign a handle. So for example, at OECD, it's a really important way to utilize these tools. The likes of Keyhole, Hootsuite, and Sprout Social offer a free version, and then you can pay to get more data. But whatever you're doing with analytical tools with social, you're trying to identify what the return on investment was from where you put your messaging, and more importantly, did your audience understand it, and how have they engaged with the creation of your content? Next slide, please, Victor. So this is a Keyhole. This is one I really rate. So I've put this one in. Keyhole, like I say, does come with a free test version, but you can also get, if you are a charity or in the educational sector, you can get free platforms. Keyhole allows you to monitor both a handle, so a main tag that is on your social media platform, but also it allows you to monitor hashtags. So you can look more broadly across the whole of the social media global sphere and see how a trend is performing. And it's really important in terms of monitoring that effectiveness. If you are trying to, for example, campaign in the scenario of, for example, a hurricane or a crisis, you might want to see what all the comments are around that crisis, and there would be a hashtag, and it would allow you to get a gauge on how your audience is feeling, what the sentiment is, and how you would want to engage with them. Likewise, we used this for the Royal Youth Project to understand what the trends were for young people, how they were feeling, and more importantly, in our scenario, we wanted to look through that lens of the young people and understand how they would connect with policy, if they would connect with policy. And we found it wasn't a lack of their desire to connect, it was that they didn't actually know how to connect. And that gave us the catalyst to be able to develop our communications to make it even richer and ensure that we were targeting them in the right way. Next slide, please, Victor. Another tool is Google Analytics. Again, this is free, and the way Google Analytics works is cookies. So some of that, if you turn your cookies on, then more data is shared, but quite often some of the cookies are turned off, so you get the very, very basic level. But effectively, it ping-pongs between you and your website. It collects data, and that data is converted into reports that you can just export to use for your own indication of how a campaign or how your communications are working. It's vital of this one to make sure that you have turned on all the settings. So again, it comes with a basic suite of settings, but there is the option to turn on additional things like geographical locations. You can look at interest segments, age demographics, which don't automatically are not automatically turned on, but if you go into your Google Analytics and turn them on, it will help you to monitor that. And this is a great way to see, are people going to your website, to your consultation page? If you are trying to promote a grant or a trust fund or an application, are they going to those pages? Equally, if you are putting a statement out about something that is of quite significance, how long are they taking to read that page? Therefore, the length of time will give you an indication of how well your communications are being received. And you can look to see how often they visit the website, so how many times they're going back on the website in a short period of time, and all sorts of indications in terms of their traction on your content. So this is a really rich tool. It's really worthwhile, and like I say, it doesn't cost you anything. It's there. You just need to turn it on and connect it to your websites. Next slide, please, Victor. Oh, I think there might be another one. I don't know if that one's just not carried through properly. Oh, would you mind going back one, Victor? I think it just hasn't for some reason. It's just the next one, and it just hasn't carried the design across, but that's okay. I can populate it. So next slide, please. So one of the most important things is not to disregard market research. That's a lot of digital tools I've talked about that are free or low cost, but are very effective. But the importance of market research should never be underestimated. And through the Royal Youth Project, which I've talked a lot about today, as well as a number of our other clients where they are looking to understand how the policy atmosphere is engaging with their rural communities, market research is fundamental. So that could be focus groups, it's roundtables, it's interviews on a one-to-one basis or interviews in a group environment, it's surveys, and it's secondary research. And that market research becomes just as valuable as some of the other data that I've shared. But whatever happens, and again, all three speakers have said this before me, data becomes imperatively important in determining communications are reaching the right audience and actually reaching the right mark in terms of what they want to hear and see. Next slide, please, Victor. So to finish, I've got an example. So we work with Scottish Enterprise, their Scottish Rural Leadership Programme. Both myself and my business partner, Jane Craigie, are alumni. So we had the very great pleasure of managing and supporting all of their activity with nearly 1,000 graduates of this programme over the last 3 years. One of the things they try and do is use a wide range of mechanisms to ensure that they are engaging. So these are people who are in rural areas. They are people who might be running extremely successful businesses with global business exchange. They might be doing trade economically here and overseas. They may be running charities. Likewise, they might actually be working in the policy arena. There are a really broad range of individuals. So we use a wide range of mechanisms in communications to reach them, from conversations at regular events and opportunities that host groups of them, including more recently, we hosted a parliamentary reception at the Scottish Government and we invited a member of the OECD to come and speak. We took a group to Paris a few years ago to go to the OECD and see for themselves how the interactions work and what they could learn from Scotland and across the world. We use social media, but we don't use it in a public forum. We use it in a private way. So we have a private social LinkedIn group, for example, where they can safely use the space in a confident manner to network and engage with each other, giving us that two-way communication, allowing us to really understand what their needs are. I touched on newsletters earlier. We send a monthly newsletter. We also send solus emails that are just specifically pointed. There's a consultation open, take part, there's an event happening, subscribe, anything that might give them a further indication of something that would help them and their business. We do ad hoc podcasts. It is a channel that continues to grow, particularly with young people. So that's another way of us engaging with that younger audience. And we'll just create short podcasts that they can listen to while they're working, or perhaps while they're doing housework, or whether they're in the garden. But it's a very clever way of mechanizing a good tool that's existing. And we'll do regular case studies. So we'll produce case studies to demonstrate the impact in rural Scotland, and those case studies are shared with government. They're shared with rural communities, they're shared with press. They can be used in all sorts of ways to demonstrate what we're trying to achieve. And then just last year, we created an infographic, which I think if Victor doesn't mind flipping to the next slide, you'll see, which was a very visual and a very engaging way to demonstrate the impact of this programme. So working with the programme manager, Julia Latto, we produced a 20-year impact report. And instead of doing a full report, we just did a very, very glossy 6-slide infographic leaflet. And we have been disseminating this all across rural communities through the network to indicate how well this campaign has achieved. And I think on the next slide, you can see the back of the leaflet. So that's just the back of it to show broad spread. We were covering the whole of Scotland and the impact that it has had in terms of turnover in the environment, investment and innovation, all the elements that are really important to our rural communities and resonate with our rural communities. And I think my last slide, Victor, is one more. So yes, a very big thank you. I hope that's given you some indication, and Betty, and I hope that's given you the practical top tips that you were looking for today.
No, you have actually. And as you were talking, I was reminded that I think I've used all your channels in my work. I wanted to point out just how valuable what Rebecca shared, because when I was working in government in the US, we used to reach out to the indigenous community and they only would communicate via Facebook. When we had to do a town halls, my boss wanted us to do town halls across the United States. We sent emails that were then printed and put on bulletin boards, and we had to go to the radio station, which we had our own radio station in the basement, to reach the folks who were still using radio. When we were planning the conference here, when I started working for the OECD and it was in Latin America, the entire conference was planned via WhatsApp. I'm talking from government all the way. I had to learn how to type whole documents on WhatsApp because no one read email, and it was an interesting experience. So this idea of the channels and understanding the channels that reach people is so valuable because it already starts. And younger folks, no one would talk to us if we weren't using 2-minute or 60-second videos. So here again, I mean, Rebecca touched on it, but it's important to say, like, if we're trying to reach an effective, we need to understand a bit these channels today that are being used. And I'm glad that Rebecca raised that. So with this series, you have now captured, I hope, different aspects of rural communications. We actually have time, so please, this is a moment to ask questions. This is probably my first one where we actually have 10 minutes. So any burning questions that you have for our speakers, they've shared quite a bit. Feel free to put on your Zoom hand and ask some questions. And maybe I'll ask the speakers while you're thinking about it, as you are now, have you now heard all the presentations? Was there something that resonated with you that you will take back and try to deploy in your own practices? I mean, for me, I think this idea of the ecosystem and creating an ecosystem approach to communication is something that I took for granted until I heard the presentations today. So, any burning questions for our speakers? This is your moment to capture them. Seeing none, what I will say is, as a reminder, we will do a summary. I don't think we'll do it justice. This is recorded. We'll send the links. I encourage you to engage a bit if you have questions, and we'll share the PowerPoints. Our final presentation in the series will be on the 29th. It will be on rural proofing, where we'll have a different group of actors talking about how to make it a bit more effective. If there are topics that you think we would be useful for us to cover in this format, feel free to send me an email suggesting a few topics, or write them in the chat if you have them, because we'd love to hear from you and make sure we're having discussions that are relevant to your work. And seeing no burning questions, I'm happy to give you back 12 minutes of your time. But please give our speakers a round of applause, because I thought these were really thought-provoking presentations, and they really at least are giving us something to think about. So there's your verbal applause there, um, or I say virtual, excuse me. So thank you to everyone, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or any thoughts on what we can talk about next. Thank you.